W.A.C. Bennett died in hospital in Kelowna late on Friday night. And to say it was the end of an era is banal at the very least, because in our time, in the 20 years that he was the Premier of British Columbia, not counting his stormy crossing of the floor just before that, he innovated the drive forward of British Columbia. Let's not kid ourselves. There were times when he trampled on the opposition. There were times when he lacked a great deal of patience. But boy, he was the man with the ideas. And one thing we should make quite clear, I'd like to anyway, is that W.A.C. Bennett masterminded that 20 years like nobody else could. He was a man who did things his way himself, with great success and with considerable elan. Troubles he would ignore. Good times were always ahead. Here is the Bennett home in Kelowna, where Mr. Bennett spent much of his precious private time. And as you have been told, of course, W.A.C. is to be cremated, and there will be a funeral service in Kelowna First United Church, at which he attended services regularly when he was in town. He spent a lot of time in Kelowna altogether. There will, of course, be other memorial services throughout the province. There will be one in Vancouver at the Christchurch Cathedral at 3 p.m. tomorrow. And in Victoria, the Governor-General, Ed Schreier, will attend a service at Metropolitan United Church, and cremation will follow the services in Kelowna. You know, my reporter, Brian Coxford, took a can present to us a most unusual look. At this particular time, it seems particularly appropriate, of the Bennett home in Kelowna. And it was yesterday, I think, that Brian took his camera crew, with the approval of the family, to look at 31 years of political memorabilia in the basement of the Kelowna home. With him on this little tour is Anita Tozer, his daughter, and R.J. Bennett, his other son.
In the basement of the Bennett family home, daughter Anita and son R.J. were looking over the W.A.C. Bennett souvenirs, a collection of over 31 years of public life, 20 as Premier. Some are priceless items, some caricatures, all of them museum pieces. No amount of money can buy them.
There's this inkwell, which was in the original Bank of British Columbia back in the 1800s, and found its way to England and back again to be presented to him when the new Bank of British Columbia was established. And then this is the bank book that he had, which was the first bank deposit made in the new Bank of British Columbia. And
was there a deposit in it?
Oh, yes, yes, there was. Done in the old-fashioned way where you have a credit instead of a debit. And
it was July 18th, 68.
Yeah. And the case is gold-filled kid. Lovely piece of material.
And the telephone?
The telephone is from the Premier's office, too. It's the original one that was in there, and when they rewired and modernized, this was presented to him. It's mahogany and gold, and it has the seal of the province on the dial. Then the baseball looks a little strange in this collection, but he was an avid baseball fan, which all of his friends will remember. And he used to follow the fortunes of the Milwaukee Braves when his friend Lou Perini was the owner of the Braves. And this baseball was presented to him the year that Milwaukee won the pennant, and the stand so that he would have it, and it's signed by all the team members.
This is a picture presented to Father at the time of the signing of the Columbia Treaty, and of course you can see the Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson, there, and President Johnson of the United States, and Father walking away from the plane.
And this is one of the things that resulted from that historic meeting.
Yes, this is the copy of the check which they received at that particular time.
A rather large one. I'm sure that's one of the larger ones you'll ever see.
Yes, I would think so,
yeah.
Unless inflation keeps on.
Yeah.
So this movie goes back to the just prior to 1952, and Father had it's a cartoon depicting Father and Tilly Rolston on a small lifeboat and the large ship with Social Credit, or I should say the Coalition, written on it, and Social Credit hadn't come into being as yet. And the caption underneath says, "You know, maybe it isn't going to sink after all," and this is supposed to be Tilly speaking to Father.
And of course, history tells the truth, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what happened. Now, this one, I think, had Norris at his best, and it was one that, at the time, thinking back on it, my father had a great sense of humor, and he enjoyed all of these cartoons. And this one shows the famous Flying Phil driving the car, and at what looks like breakneck speed, looking at the police escort and the motorcycle going alongside, and you have in the back seat the President Johnson and Lester Pearson, and then Father sitting in the middle with this, as Norris used to use, this Puritan-type hat on their head, and Father is sounding forth to the two of them. Now, here's the deal. Phil blacktops the road from California to the Elations. Mike gives up the Yukon, and Lyndon gives us Washington and Oregon. So that one at the time caused many a laugh, I think, in this.
There's perhaps one thing about W.A.C. Bennett's life that not too many people knew about, at least outside the family. And that involved a poem that he would read to himself every morning to psych himself up for the day. It perhaps characterized what he was all about. A poem written by Edgar A. Guest entitled, "It Couldn't Be Done." Here's how the first verse went. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he with a chuckle replied that maybe it couldn't, but he'd be the one who wouldn't say so until he tried. So he buckled right in with a trace of a grin on his face. If he worried, he hit it. He started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it.
Well, my reporter Brian Coxford is, as you know, in Kelowna, and I think Brian's live in the studio in Kelowna right now, and I've got to give you a little kind of journalistic pat in the back, Brian. That's the first time in 31 years that I interviewed and was around Premier Bennett, former Premier Bennett, that I realized that he was a poetry lover. Did you say he read that every day?
Yeah, apparently what happened, Jack, and this is a little-known fact outside of the family, that he used to recite the poem to himself, perhaps in front of the mirror when he was shaving in the morning. He used it as sort of a psychological thing to psych him up. If there was a task that he figured was perhaps too tough to handle, he'd get some inspiration from this particular poem, and that's more or less what he patterned his life around. That's what we've been told.
Well, matter of fact, I don't think I ever interviewed him when he was down, you know, because he'd come in there full of, what's the word, pizzazz. As soon as the microphones were on, he was away. Brian, what's been happening in Kelowna since you did the little piece in the basement of the Bennett home?
Well, if you can appreciate, Jack, the death happened at 10:30 on Friday night, and as a result of the weekend's activities, etc., it took perhaps a little longer to get funeral arrangements set up and to find out who was going to be coming here to the funeral, what dignitaries, what government heads. And those wheels will more or less be turning very fast this morning as the lines are open. People are back at the office in Victoria, and we'll be able to determine exactly which government heads will be here. We do know that the Governor General will be in Victoria along with the Lieutenant Governor at one of the services. And at the service here in Kelowna, the eulogy to be delivered by Grace McCarthy, who was a cabinet minister under W.A.C. Bennett, and of course we know as a cabinet minister now. All of the old W.A.C. Bennett cabinet ministers will be here, with one exception. Ray Williston will be in Victoria to deliver the eulogy there. And we should say two exceptions, because Robert Bonner will deliver the eulogy at a special Vancouver service, which will take place an hour after the Victoria and Kelowna ones.
Messages of condolences coming in from all over the country?
They are. Prime Minister sent a telegram, various other dignitaries, all the social credit constituencies in the province sent telegrams, former cabinet ministers, flowers from very close friends here in Kelowna. Because the florist shops were closed over the weekend and deliveries stopped at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, not all the flowers have arrived, and I'm sure it's going to be quite a busy scene at the Bennett home today.
And you're going to stay up for the memorial service in Kelowna tomorrow?
Yes, that'll be at 2 o'clock at First Church United Church here in Kelowna, and that was the church that W.A.C. Bennett used to attend. That was his family church here in Kelowna.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Brian. Much obliged. I'm going to leave the analysis and the inquest on the political career of W.A.C. Bennett to the political scientists. But once a number of years ago, he said to me, Webster. In fact, once he phoned me up when I was doing a piece on there and said, Webster, you're a liar. It hung up in my ear, and I never was able to get him back on that issue. I can't even remember what the issue was at the time. Something to do with the interest on parity bonds or some bank transaction, because, as you know, he was his own finance minister in spades. We'll leave all that to the political scientists, but for 31 years association as a reporter with Mr. Bennett, a man who has drunk interminable cups of tea when he held his little Christmas bash in the Hotel Vancouver, you always had to be on your toes. He never failed to fly a kite, and a couple of times I missed the kites. I remember once, before the Bank of BC caper, comes in from California, and he says, we're all sitting around, and he says, wonderful banks they have in California, magnificent banks, owned and controlled on the West Coast. We should have such a bank in British Columbia. Is that on the record or off the record, Mr. Bennett? Oh, no, that's just background. It's not really, you know, it's just that I'm very impressed with the banks. So, of course, we all went dutifully out and wrote non-attributable stories on the possibility of banks. He just used us, you know, in a very clever political manner. And a couple of months later up, of course, came his first big battle for a bank charter in Ottawa on the Bank of British Columbia. That was a battle he didn't quite win, but most of the battles he won. But I suppose if you go over his inventive mind, boy, was he inventive. Net debt, remember? Wiped it out, $191 million by a stroke of a pen, and called it contingent liability. And in no time flat, he had most of us believing it. And then his homeowner grant. That was another stroke of political genius, because the homeowner grant could variously be described in budget speeches as various things, but the man in the street, the man paying his taxes, knew that at the bottom of his tax form, it said, provincial grant, taken off your school purposes grant. And he knew that that was a gift direct from W.A.C. Bennett's government in Victoria. And of course, the successive politicians. Once W.A.C. had put these kind of things into operation, nobody could touch them. They were then carved in stone, and still are carved in stone. He has never been given quite enough credit, though, for his overall masterminding of the plan. When he took over in 1952, remember that one-seat caper when Harold Winch and when he called the election, Harold Winch asked the Lieutenant Governor to give the reins of power to the old CCF. Didn't do it, as a matter of fact. But from then on, he was coming in on the rising tide of the post-war era. But he was the one who masterminded, without doubt, on his personal plan for British Columbia to open up the entire province. And he did it first with roads. And he did it in spades, as we well know. It was the blacktop government, and a most effective blacktop government, because places got roads that never had roads before in British Columbia. Same with the railway. The railway financing is under criticism now, but it was Bennett who pushed the prosperity north to Prince George, and beyond that, Summit Lake and Fort Nelson, etc., etc., etc. People may now quibble about the drive to Dease Lake. People may well say that he didn't recognize that the day of the Pioneer Railroad was over. But the money and the improvement in the economy that was poured into those parts of BC was truly phenomenal. Same with the, leave power for a moment. Let's talk about ferries. Boy, what he did to the CPR was a thing to remember. When he had trouble on the ferries, when he had trouble with the employees, he brought in the Civil Defense Act, took over, and despite our quibble about the ferries today, he set up the second largest ferry fleet in the entire world, which operates with remarkable efficiency. The last time I interviewed him, I saw him in his house in Kelowna, and he came, and he was so anxious to do something on the air that when he came to town the next time we met and we did a radio broadcast, and he said to me, and I remember with great accuracy what he said. He said, Jack, he said, he didn't use Mr. Webster on this occasion. Normally it was Mr. Webster, or just a glinty look at you as you asked some potentially embarrassing question. He said, Jack, if there's one thing I want to be remembered for, he said, it's the Columbia River Treaty.